What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of Best Armies in 40k, the weekly video series where we go through competitive events from the last week and take a peek at undefeated results. We are now firmly inside the Pariah Nexus season, so we're going to be talking about a wide variety of events of various sizes that use the Pariah Nexus rules. And if you're interested in seeing some Pariah Nexus games, we're going to be having a lot of exciting things going on in the channel over the next couple days. It's going to be an insane week over here. We've got the T5S2 Invitational starting just today. You can find out more about that at tts40k.com/invitational. That is a 400 plus player online tournament series, and we've taken the top 16 players and are going to have them play out a double elimination event to crown the season champion. On top of that, I'm also going to be traveling this week to the ATC, the America's Team Championship, the largest team event in North America. So stay tuned to this channel for live coverage of that starting on Friday. And as always, thanks to everybody who supports the channel and all of the streaming endeavors that I do. That includes all the folks over at Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, you can join in the link down below the video in the video description, as well as Twitch subscribers over on my Twitch channel. I really appreciate all of you. You guys help me get out to do this content and this community support. And if anybody else wants to join them, and I greatly appreciate everyone who joins them. And with that, let's dive in and talk about a metagame breakdown. We are seeing a little bit of a consolidation of the metagame this week. While in the past weeks we have seen lots of factions with individual undefeated results, today a couple factions are sort of leading the pack. Adepta Sororitas coming out with 2 undefeated results from the Goonhammer Open and the Geelong Town Open. That does seem a little bit low for Adepta Sororitas so far, though, because it does definitely seem like those are going to be the front runners for the season moving forward, although we'll have to see if that pans out. Tau Empire also doing fairly well, both at the Winchester GT and Dark Sphere July GT. Drukhari with 2 undefeated results as well at the Bembel Clash and Tormenta de Hostias, as well as World Eaters at Warzone Man, and similarly also at the Tormenta de Hostias. We then saw a smattering of factions with a single result. Leagues of Votann at the TM Iron Man, Thousand Suns with a 4-0-1 result. That's 1 draw in their record at the Red Dragon GT. Death Guard at the Central Island Open. Chaos Demons at Geekfest, and Chaos Space Marines at the Dark Sphere July GT. On top of the factions that we kind of expected to be doing well, Adepta Sororitas being one of them with a really strong new codex, it does seem like melee factions are starting to come into their own. We're seeing World Eaters and Drukhari both with good results this week, which would have been fairly surprising in the previous season, but it does seem like Pariah Nexus does give a little bit of reward to these more aggressive armies. So let's take a look at exactly what these armies were bringing in their lists, starting with the Goonhammer Open, where Tony Phillips went undefeated with Adepta Sororitas in a Bringers of Flame detachment. While it's not the only competitively viable detachment in the Sisters Codex, Bringers of Flame is definitely going to be the most popular, at least for the foreseeable future, and it's no surprise that we saw a lot of Adepta Sororitas players picking it up. This list was running a Canoness with a jump pack using the Fire and Fury enhancement to improve the attacks of Torrent weapons that in her attached unit, also giving her sustained hits 1 on her other ranged attacks. We do have a 10 model Seraphim squad with 8 Metastorm Hand Flamers for that model to attach into, and she herself comes with a Hand Flamer, so she's essentially adding D6 plus 9 attacks into that Seraphim squad, which then can be comboed with the detachment to grant those Flamers devastating wounds. I have a whole video about Seraphim and how much damage this unit can actually do with this combination that I released last week that you can go check out. We also have a Dialogus, as well as the Morvenval and the ever-present Triumph of St. Catherine, which can improve the movement speed of all of the nearby units, but also because in Bringers of the Flame, all of the Sisters units gain Assault, and it grants an additional bonus to models advancing. You can actually get potentially up to +3 inches of movement, plus a Miracle 6 on an advance, which you can get automatically from the Triumph for an effective +9 inches of movement, essentially for free. We then had 1 Battle Sister squad, 3 Immolators, as well as 2 Castigators. Those Immolators embarking a combination of the Battle Sister squad as well as a Dominion squad with 4 Meltaguns. We also saw Paragon Warsuits from Morvenval to join into, and 2 small 5 model Seraphim squads, those also equipped with Hand Flamers to act as utility, plus a Sisters Novitiate squad to infiltrate up the table. This list is largely a Sisters All-Stars, especially bringing all of the classic combinations from the Bringers of the Flame detachment, but we're going to see these units like the Dominion Immolators as well as Castigators basically taken in these numbers in essentially every Sisters list from here on out, I would imagine. They are just so efficient and so synergistic with each other. The Immolators Annihilators can give ignore cover, +1 AP from the Castigators, which can cycle into miracle dice generated from the Triumph of St. Catherine to allow Melty-Guns with Assault and +1 Strength, ignore cover, and +1 AP to punch through basically any armor value and deal ridiculous damage from those Dominion squads. The whole army works together like a well-oiled machine, and it's what makes Sisters so strong right now. And moving on, we also saw Tau Empire doing fairly well, and we're going to be moving over to the Dark Sphere GT, where Lewis Smith went undefeated 5-0 with a very spicy Tau Empire list. This was a Kauyon detachment, bringing the Index detachment for the faction. Not moving into any of those exciting Codex detachments like Montka or Retaliation Cadre, but Lewis was making up for that with some really interesting inclusions. He was taking 2 Cadre Fireblades, one of them with an exemplar of the Kauyon to turn on his Kauyon abilities 1 turn earlier. Those guys were attaching into 2 of the 3 Breacher teams in the army, and we also saw 2 Devilfish to embark those Breacher teams into. Leading the army was Commander Shadow Sun, who can grant some CP regeneration, which is extremely important in Pariah Nexus, with the ability to now redraw tactical objectives multiple times in a game. We then also had a Ghostkill battlesuit, a Pathfinder team for spotting, alongside 3 units of stealth battlesuits, 3 Riptide battlesuits to take up the backline, a Piranha as an additional forward operator, and last, but certainly not least, a Tigershark. Now, for those who don't know, the Tigershark is the enormous, not super heavy aircraft, but definitely extremely large. It comes in at 18 wounds at T11, so it is extremely difficult to take down. And without the hover ability, it must start off the table. That does give it the opportunity to alpha strike its opponent. And if you don't have great true line of sight blocking ruin terrain, this thing can basically draw line of sight to anything that it wants to on battle round 2 or 3 when Kauyon comes into effect. This version was running 2 ion cannons for a total of 2d6 plus 6, strength 8, 3 damage gunshots with potential double blast, alongside anti-fly Sky Spear missile racks, 6 seeker missiles, and up to 2 cyclic ion blasters. Tigershark can put out an immense amount of damage, especially when comboed with that Kauyon ability to gain those additional sustained hits and absolutely overload the saving throws of anything that they're going to be shooting into. And with the ability to just rinse down a target with massed seeker missiles when it comes on the table, this guy can absolutely be guaranteed at least 1 kill, and on that's probably a go turn when the Breachers are also pushing forward, so your opponent is theoretically overloaded on threats and can't necessarily kill the Tigershark, Riptide battlesuits, and the Breachers pushing up the table when it gets to that Kauyon activation in battle round 3 or later. Super interesting inclusion to bring in the Tigershark with this detachment. I do think this guy does have a lot of play, definitely in Kauyon, where you are incentivized to attack your opponent as late in the game as possible. Starting in Strategic Reserve as an aircraft is not so bad for this thing, whereas in a Montka detachment, for example, it would be a little problematic that you would be losing an entire round or more of Montka for it starting in reserve. And also being an extremely tanky profile means that it can rapid ingress into positions where not the entire opponent's army can shoot at it and not necessarily be in danger, using its then incredibly beneficial line of sight rules to get a bead on essentially any hard target in the opponent's army and take it out before it's able to kill the Tigershark in response. You have to be hiding from the Riptide battlesuits for most of the game anyway, in order to not just get randomly devastating wounded by those guys in the early game, and that means you will likely not be able to see the Tigershark once it jumps in on you. And then moves us over to the Tormenta de Hostias, where Garza Garceta went undefeated with Drukhari, a Sky Splinter Assault, using those new cool Lord of Deceit mechanics that the faction gets access to. Garza was rocking an Archon with the Nightmare Shroud to prevent enemies from overwatching him, alongside 2 additional Archons, a Beastmaster, Drazar, and Lelith Hesperax. We also saw a Kabalite Warrior squad as well as Witches for Lelith to jump into. Those were supported by 4 Venoms and 2 Raiders to carry them around the table, a Court of the Archon that could potentially jump in with one of the Archons. You could use the Venom to potentially split up one of the Kabalite Warrior squads into 2 smaller units and then attach the Court into it, attach the Archon in with the Court, and embark all of those guys into a Raider to make the transport capacity work. We had a single Chronos to regenerate Pain token, as well as 2 Incubi units, 1 of 10 and 1 of 5, to join either the Archons or Drazar into to give them their benefits, alongside 2 units of Mandrakes and 3 units of Scourges, with a combination of Dark Lances and Drukhari Haywire Blasters, 2 Dark Lance units and 1 Haywire Blaster unit to deal with harder vehicle targets. As I mentioned before, I do think that these faster armies are definitely benefited by Pariah Nexus, and especially its tighter terrain setups, which make getting up the table with melee units much easier. And for an army as fragile as Drukhari can be, that's certainly a godsend for them. I do think that the Pariah Nexus season is going to be pretty good for them. It's unknown whether they got huge benefits out of the new rotational rules in this event. Obviously, those are pretty controversial, and a lot of places have introduced house rules to counteract gaining additional movement from rotating with units like Raiders and Venoms that interact really strangely with those abilities. That said, I don't know how much that transforms the win rate of the faction, and I do think that the new missions as well as the new terrain layouts are going to be the deciding factor for Drukhari. Now, staying with both the tournament as well as the style of army, let's talk about some World Eaters. The player Yusukane brought World Eaters to the Tormenta de Hostias and brought them to a 5-0 record. The tournament was large enough to have 2 undefeated players at the end of round 5. Yusukane was playing Angron as well as Lord Invocatus and a Juggernaut Lord with the Helm of Brazen Ire to reduce incoming damage against him, a single unit of Jackals as well as a ton of 8-bound to push up the table alongside Invocatus. That was 2 units of 3 standard 8-bound and 2 units of 6 exalted 8-bound. Those were then followed up by a Chaos Spawn unit of just 2 Chaos Spawn to act as utility. We then had 2 World Eaters Forge Fiends with Ectoplasma Cannons bringing out the rear. I actually love these guys at their 145 point cost. Ectoplasm Forge Fiends have a pretty good profile against a wide variety of targets. They have multiple blast weapons to fire into infantry. They're strength 10, AP 3, 3 damage to fire into light or medium vehicles. And at a relatively low points value, they can trade out with other heavy anti-tank weapons. World Eaters really like having a ranged element in their army in order to clear out their opponent's screens or force their opponent to play more aggressively or even more defensively than they would normally want to against a faction that is typically all melee all the time. That means that you can be dealing damage to your opponent without having to commit your 8-bound Angron or your expensive characters, and that just makes the World Eaters army stronger in the late game. Not to mention the fact that these guys can also gain benefits like +2 movement from a Blessing of Khorne, which can make them very difficult to dodge once they start moving around corners and jumping around the table. And that moves us on to the Leagues of Votann, which took down the TM Iron Man event with Joe Dino at the helm. Joe is running a Brokir Iron Masters, as well as a pair of Einhir Champions, 1 unit of Hearthkin Warriors, and 3 Sagitors to embark them into. We had 2 units of Chthonian Berserks, 5 models apiece in those units that could jump into 2 of the Sagitors, the last Sagitor probably taking a combat squad of 5 of those Hearthkin Warriors up the table. We then had 2 units of Brokir Thunderkin, 1 unit of 6, as well as 1 unit of 3. Unit of 6 probably coming out of reserve to use their Graviton Blast Cannons to clear away a particularly sticky enemy target. 2 units of 5 Einhir Hearthguard to jump those Einhir Champions into. 1 Hekaton Land Fortress, which is likely embarking the smaller unit of 3 Brokir Thunderkin, but it can also carry the smaller Einhir Hearthguard units to the table as well. That Land Fortress was running a Conversion Beamer on its top gun, as well as 3 units of Hernkin Pioneers and a unit of the new Hernkin Jaegers to bring a ton of forward operation to the table. Alongside the 3 Sagittors and 3 Hernkin Pioneer units, that's a total of 6 scouting units that can be protected in the early game by the Hernkin Jaegers, which can infiltrate up the table to prevent the enemy from blocking those scout moves from occurring. The Jaegers were a hugely transformative addition to these very aggressive scout-oriented Votann builds because they can take table space in the early game in order to prevent you from stopping those scout units from moving up and engaging your army immediately off the rip at the top of round 1. Alongside a reactive move and a fairly reasonable points cost, I think the Jaegers are going to be taken in a lot of Votann armies moving on into the future. And that moves us over to the Red Dragon July GT, which was taken down by Jeremy Atkinson, who went 4-0-1 with... Now, this event did use differential scoring, so those draws are a little bit easier to achieve, since you have to beat your opponent by at least 5 points in order to actually secure an 11-9 win. In this case, that one result was a 10-10 win, but Jeremy had some very good results, especially earlier on in the tournament, with 2 20-0 wins, the maximum you can get in that scoring system early on in the event. Jeremy was running Ahriman on a Disc of Tzeentch alongside 2 Exalted Disc Sorcerers, one of them with the Lord of Forbidden Lore to duplicate a ritual. We then also had 3 Infernal Masters, one of them with the Umbralific Crystal, and one of them with Arcane Vortex for +1 strength and damage on his psychic weapons alongside Magnus the Red. Those attached into 3 Rubric Marine units. and were followed up by a lot of support and utility, including 2 Mutalisk Vortex Beasts to extend the range of the Kabbalistic rituals in the Thousand Suns army, 2 units of Thousand Suns cultists to add some forward operators in the early game, alongside 3 units of Zangor Enlightened for objective scoring and utility. Beyond the Mutalisk Vortex Beasts and the Rubric squads, this list was very light on combat units, but extremely heavy on scoring units, which made those early game high scores make a lot of sense. With the newfound ability to reduce the cost of all stratagems that Thousand Suns have access to rather than simply their battle tactics, Thousand Suns now have easier access to some of their more expensive stratagems, especially things like Warp Sight to give them indirect fire, which they can essentially pay 6 Cabal points alongside 1 command point for, instead of the 2 command points it used to cost previously. That cost can also be offset by the Chaos Cultists, which can generate command points when they die or kill enemy units. But realistically, what we're going to be seeing is these Exalted Sorcerers and Ahriman, the Disc Sorcerers, running up the table to gain line of sight to enemies, discounting that Warp Sight to give all of the Infernal Masters, Magnus, and the other terrifying Flamer-equipped psychic weapons indirect fire against a single target, since most of those offensive weapons are either rerolling their hit rolls or automatically hitting because they're torrents. They can fire indirectly, even with the new indirect fire nerfs, without really worrying about the downside so much, allowing Magnus and his cohort to attack from out of line of sight, essentially with impunity. That allows you to trade these smaller disc sorcerers for essentially enemy unit extremely effectively. Now, staying with the chaos theme, which we're going to be doing actually for the rest of the video, now that I'm looking at the results we got, let's talk about Death Guard. Ian Harris took Death Guard to an undefeated result at the Central Island Open. He was running a plague company led by a Lord of Virulence alongside Typhus as the only characters. This list was incredibly spicy, extremely tanky. We see Death Guard moving in this tankier direction more and more as the weeks go on, including 2 units of 6 Death Shroud Terminators, the maximum unit size, to attach the Lord of Virulence and Typhus into, 1 Plague Bridge Crawler and a Fetid Blow Drone to add some indirect fire and speed to the army, and then everything else was a big scary tank, including 3 Predator Annihilators, a Hellbrute, and 3 Defilers. With the ability of the Hellbrute to project contagion auras onto enemies offensively, the sort of medium shooting from the Defilers can get buffed up enough to do some serious damage to heavier tanks, and following that up with massive laser cannon salvos from the Predator Annihilators makes this army pretty scary to any heavily armored opponent. You can then use the Death Shroud Terminators, which have mass flamer attacks and good sweep profiles to kill enemy infantry, and altogether present an incredibly strong SKU list. A ton of high toughness, high resilience vehicle units that could potentially be protected by the -1 weapon skill auras if you need them to, or even just buff themselves by reducing enemy armor saves once they're shot at by that Hellbrute. It's difficult to trade up into a list like this when the combination of Death Guard debuffs can make basically any of these vehicles deadly against most enemy profiles, and especially so when the heart of the list that you're trying to get at is 12 Death Shroud Terminators with very powerful characters attached. The one downside is its objective scoring, but clearly that wasn't that big of a deal since Ian was able to go 5-0 with this archetype, regardless of the fact that he took essentially no utility units at all. We don't see Nurglings or Cultists or other similar units that we typically see in Death Guard, instead just relying on a Fetid Blow Drone to act as the lighter, faster, utility-oriented inclusion in the list, and hoping that the rest of the list's pure attrition and damage output can see it through. Now, speaking of attrition and damage output, let's move over to Chaos Demons, in which we saw those styles of combat basically made manifest. Blair McDonald took Chaos Demons to a 5-0 record at the Geekfest GT. This was an incredibly spicy Nurgle and Khorne combined list, which I do think have come out as the 2 greatest allegiances inside the Chaos Demons faction. That included a Bloodthirster with Argath, the King of Blade, to improve his strength and attacks permanently now that the Bloodthirster projects a Shadow of Chaos aura for Khorne units. We also saw a Great Unclean One with the Endless Gift to improve his survivability, a Rendmaster on a Blood Throne, the central combo instigator of the Khorne subfaction. He can buff you for +1 strength, attack, and damage on any of your Khorne units, making either the Bloodthirster hit ludicrously hard, or even lighter units like Bloodletters hit fairly hard as well. We did see 1 Bloodletter unit in the army alongside Skulltaker to give them devastating wounds, 2 units of Blood Crushers, as well as 2 Skull Cannons, not only to give the army a little bit of pretty reasonable shooting, but also those Skull Cannons not the worst in melee as well, especially when buffed up by that Rendmaster. They were backed up by a Wardog Carnivore alongside a bunch of Nurgle demons, 10 Plague Bearers, 3 Nurglings, and 2 Beasts of Nurgle to both act as utility and hold down the backline line from any enemies trying to sneak away those demonically corrupted objectives. These Khorne demon combinations are incredibly strong. The downside is their resilience, but obviously that can be made up for by the Nurgle contingent, especially that now permanently 4+ Feel No Pain Endless Gift Great Unclean One, forcing the opponent to come in and overcommit into the Great Unclean One to actually get rid of it and stop it from just locking in the center objective and scoring it for the rest of the game, means that you can counterpunch at the units like Blood Crushers and the Bloodthirster very effectively, especially with the Bloodthirster now able to advance up the table and charge regardless of the Shadow of Chaos situation, since they're always considered to be in Shadow of Chaos now. And that makes these way more aggressive demon lists way stronger than they were in the past. And that moves us on to our last list for the day, Samuel Smith and Chaos Space Marines going undefeated at the Dark Sphere July GT with a very spicy Pact-bound Zealot build. Pact-bound Zealot is the new implementation of the Index detachment that Chaos Space Marines had access to back in the day that terrorized the competitive scene to the point where it had to get nerfed basically into the stratosphere. This list has eschewed the Chaos Lords, Abaddon the Despoiler, and the other characters that the faction has hung its hat on for the last couple of weeks, instead opting to take simply 2 Dark Communes with Mark of Chaos Undivided to unlock for themselves Profane Zeal. We then see a Mark of Nurgle Cultist squad, 2 units of Mark of Slaanesh Legionaries, just 5 models apiece. There is a Chaos Rhino to embark those dudes into, so we can get them up the table fairly efficiently, and with the ability to advance and charge from the Mark of Slaanesh, they can move up and reroll their wounds on enemies on objectives, and act as pretty reasonably costed trading units. We then have 1 unit of Mark of Slaanesh Raptors, basically for the same reason, 2 units of Mark of Nurgle Chaos Bikers that also act as utility, a ton of backline shooting, including a War Dog Carnivore. Interesting to see the Singleton War Dog Carnivore being taken in more of these Chaos lists, alongside 2 Predator Destructors and 3 Chaos Vindicators. Chaos Vindicators with Mark of Nurgle make them incredibly difficult to engage with at a long distance, since they can become unshootable on command, and they come back super hard with their very, very powerful Demolisher Cannon being buffed by Dark Pacts. I have a whole video about exactly how strong Vindicators are in Chaos Space Marines that you can check out separately. Last but certainly not least, we had 2 units of Accursed Cultists to attach those Dark Communes into. Those guys also obviously with Mark of Chaos Undivided to give them access to that wound buff from Profane Zeal. With the once per game +1 to hit and wound from the Dark Commune alongside that Profane Zeal for wound rerolls as well, the Accursed Cultists can hit extremely hard when fully buffed up, and with their ability to take the mid-board very early, they can force back opponents from being able to profitably engage into the Chaos Space Marine army and stop those backline tanks from being able to shoot. Very cool build of Chaos Space Marines from this one. It's not the Renegade Raiders that we've been seeing so often, and it just goes to show you that despite their nerfs, Chaos Space Marines do have a lot of really interesting builds available to them. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these lists. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.